So I was trying to convince my wife that she should watch The Nevers with me, despite her profound disinterest, because she was a fan of Poldark and she liked Eleanor Tomlinson in that show. Yeah, so long, Demelza. We hardly knew thee. But this episode of The Nevers, Ignition, the third episode of the first season, Drew here, by the way, the Whedon touch is gone a little bit since he didn't actually direct this episode as he did the first two. And I feel like from an artistic perspective, even though I doubt many people think of Joss Whedon as like an exemplifier of great artistry, I do feel like things have been set back a little bit. He did have a certain touch, if you know what I mean, that you miss the moment that it's gone. It's interesting, this episode, obviously the death of Mary Brighton is going to be a pivotal plot point going forward, and it seems pretty obvious to me that Lavinia Bidlow is implicated in her death, but more on that later. But it's interesting because I feel like there's this new trend in TV shows, and maybe it's not an entirely new trend, but I feel like it's been more pronounced ever since Game of Thrones, where shows, and particularly HBO, will bring on these high-profile actors, or at least recognizable actors, and then they will kill them off over the course of the first season of a show. And this, does create a certain unpredictability to the proceedings. Now, I kind of suspected that this might happen, mainly because, yes, this has been a trend on TV lately, but also I kept having to ask myself, why is Eleanor Tomlinson in this show? I feel like she's enough of a known talent that she wouldn't commit to such a small supporting role in a show like this. But I do feel like her casting was important because she brought this convincing both outer and inner beauty as this character of Mary Brighton. And it was important that we as an audience be as entranced with the song that she was singing as the touch were. And I feel that they did capture the ethereal beauty of this connection that Mary Brighton was helping the touch to discover. And it was a very jarring moment, even though I kind of saw it coming, when she was killed and assassinated as she was. I feel like this episode, most people are going to be focused on that moment, and they're also going to be focused on Amalia versus Odium. And it seems pretty clear. I had seen some people theorizing that Lavinia sent Odium after Amalia, but no, it was pretty clearly the Beggar King, because he thinks that she was helping Bonfire Annie to muscle in on his territory, as in the opening sequence where they show up to have a chat with her. So it seems pretty obvious to me that Nick Frost's Beggar King sent Odium after Amalia. And this scene was intense. I thought the soundtrack was really, really good at making your skin kind of crawl. And the performance by the actor playing Odium, who is just a beast of a man, and the way that the special effects were just blended seamlessly, I really didn't even realize until I watched the behind the scenes footage how much work went into making this sequence. But they were very, very excited about it, and I don't blame them, because I think it's one of the first action sequences in the show that I think was like something where I was like, man, I've never seen something quite like this fight sequence before. At some level, it wasn't that interesting because it's just Amalia fighting a random stooge, even if he is extremely intimidating and it's very well executed. But at a certain level, it didn't matter. I feel like if you make a situation in a show intense enough, the audience will be on the edge of their seat. And I feel like this kind of fit the bill, even if it was pretty obvious Amalia was going to come out on top or on the bottom, depending on your point of view. Lots of questions in this show, and the show continues to withhold a lot of answers, but we did get a few little tidbits this episode, a few little revelations. I think that the revelation that was most interesting to me is that Frank Mundai is being blackmailed by Hugo Swan to find out more information about Amalia and the rest of the touched at this school. And it seems that he's hoping to hijack some of them for his brothel. Although maybe he has other purposes, it remains to be seen. I still don't really understand the purpose of Hugo in this story, except perhaps to bring in the sexual scenes that will appeal to the Game of Thrones audience. But to me, that would be to take the wrong lesson away from Game of Thrones, honestly. I don't really think that was what drew people in at the end of the day. I could be wrong. Some of you, maybe that was the main reason you watched that show if you did. But to me, I feel like that was not the main draw. And it's not really the main draw here either. And in some ways, it just feels like an unnecessary distraction. The scenes taking place in Hugo Swann's brothel. And the character on the whole, I really do feel like it's interesting. I've been questioning, does Hugo Swann have the power to make people just attracted to him against their will? I mean, he doesn't really need it. I mean, it could just be the perks of having James Norton's looks. But I feel that it would be interesting because they've said that we don't actually know everyone that is touched yet. So I keep looking for characters that might be touched that it hasn't been revealed. I suppose it's always a possibility that, for instance, Lavinia Bidlow is among the touched. As I said earlier, I think it's pretty obvious that Lavinia, as we discovered last episode, she has ulterior motives for her involvement with the touched, and she's not as fond of them as she seems initially to be. But this episode, we find out that someone is, summoning touched to this location, apparently to kill them, and that it's the same individuals that, attacked Amalia and Penance in the first episode. And Amalia immediately runs off to tell Lavinia about this, and then also tells her, by the way, we're going to have, Mary Brighton sing her song out in the park at this time. So is it a coincidence that is where the assassin that was working with Malady shows up and kills Mary Brighton? I don't really think it is. I think Lavinia was the one who set her out to try. And what her motivations are, again, we have more questions about that than answers at this point. But it seems pretty clear to me that that's what happened in terms of who set Mary Brighton up to get killed. I thought that Frank Mundai's reaction to Mary Brighton's death was perhaps the most touching. I feel like he had this very interesting scene with her earlier in the episode where essentially I was really confused when it turned out that he apparently is gay and that he's being blackmailed by Hugo Swann, because I was like, that doesn't really seem to make sense with the fact that he's so infatuated with Mary Brighton. But then you realize, well, that's why the wedding got called off, because she knew. And that makes, in some ways, his affection for her all the more touching, because it's not a sexual affection at all. It's a affection born out of deep regard that is platonic, seemingly, or at least, not a sexual type of love. And to me, that's in many ways more compelling than a passionate, ardor born out of desire. And his reaction, rushing into danger to avenge her death, I feel like this character, he's constantly putting on this outward gruffness to perhaps hide the fact that he's uncomfortable with, what desires he has. And it was interesting to see this episode that I feel like they've kind of, made the touched like a sign that someone is on the outskirts of society, that there's someone that's marginalized. And it's interesting that despite the fact that he's very, very much marginalized as a gay man in this time period in history, it's interesting that he is not seemingly one of the touched, that he doesn't hear Mary Brighton's song, even though he longs to. And it'd be interesting, it is curious, his line, people can change. It makes you wonder whether or not some people will find themselves acquiring abilities as the show progresses, and if perhaps Frank might be one of them. I kind of feel like it would be a good idea not for that to not happen, because I think it's a good idea to have people who are involved in the story that are looking at the touched from an outsider's perspective, that don't have the same abilities that they do. I feel like, it was kind of a problem with Westworld when everyone turned out to be an android. I felt like it was good to have some human characters, or characters that, so here similarly, I think it's a good idea not to have everyone be touched. Other revelations, it seems like Lord Masson has his granddaughter in his basement. It was kind of unclear, but we saw eagle-eyed people apparently spotted the fact that in the first episode she was one of the people to be touched. So it seems like, you're kind of being led to assume that she might have died, but it seems like, no, maybe she didn't. Maybe he's like so ashamed of her that he's keeping her in his basement. And that's another, added level of complexity to his character, that his hatred of the other is leading him to turn against his own flesh and blood. So on the whole, Mary Brighton's death, it was kind of a bummer, but it did bring all these different individuals who were touched, including Bonfire Annie, to the school. At this point, it was interesting because Mary Brighton, this episode, she questioned whether or not she should bring people to the school with her song, because she's like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what the purpose of this is. And it's interesting because we as the audience, I feel like we kind of are in a similar boat where it's like, well, we don't really know what Amalia's backstory is. We don't really know what the purpose of the school is. All the students, when asked by Mary, gave different answers. And we don't know what Lavinia's motivation is for the school, why she's the one pushing it forward. So all these things are question marks. So it's a little bit mixed emotions. Like, it would be like this empowering moment. Oh, see, Mary Brighton died, but her song drew all these people to this place where they can belong. But at this point, we don't know that that's true. We don't know if this school is really a place like that for them. And I feel to a certain extent that all these questions are kind of hampering the show. I feel like they would be in a better spot if they would give us a little bit more understanding of what's going on, and, allow a little bit more understanding of what we can and can't root for and what the characters' ultimate goals are. I still feel like the heart of the show is Amalia and Penance and their relationship. I really found their camaraderie this episode to be quite touching. I admire this portrayal of female friendship. I thought the scene in particular where Penance accidentally inhaled opium and then Amalia went and intentionally did it so that she could bond with her friend, I thought that was a touching moment. And I really think that Amalia is a strong character. I thought her fight scene with Odium was engaging, not the least of which because they've really done a good job of building up Amalia as this tougher than nails woman who's really, really plucky. They got her into her petticoats again, of course, but that's neither here nor there. So those are my thoughts on the third episode of the first season of The Nevers, Ignition. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.